Well, good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning for most of you. Good afternoon if you're joining us from the East Coast. It's a real pleasure for Steve Patterson and I to have you join us for this conversation. Conversations in Crisis is sort of the name of the series, but today we're really going to be focusing more on sports. And we won't do biographical introductions. I think you probably follow us on LinkedIn or some other way that you got to us, so you probably know who we are. But what Steve and I thought we would talk about, we've had the privilege of working with a lot of organizations over the past 8 to 10 weeks as they came into this COVID-19 crisis, as they've kind of endured the middle of it, and now as they're hopefully eyeing what could be the beginning of the end. I can't quote the Winston Churchill statement precisely, but it's either the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning or something like that. At any rate, Steve, great to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Chad. Great to be here with you guys today and all of the other folks.
So I thought what we would do, Steve, is really kind of just start out at sort of a high level. Some of the thinking that we've been sharing with regard to an overall approach to managing this and other crises, and then really shift more into some of the observations we've made as we've talked to a number of different organizations, both at the collegiate level, but also at the professional level. And as you know, going in, one of the things that we said at the very beginning was that this was an excellent time to build what we called great will with all of your key constituents. And we distinguish between goodwill and great will, because great will really means going above and beyond. And we've kind of said that there are three ways that you really do that. You know, one is to surprise, and then secondly, delight, and then third, engage your key constituents. And we've also talked about that this is probably the worst time for doing any selling, if you will, because people really just are so focused. They have so much anxiety in their current situations that anything that you can do to help them, reassure them, again, surprise them and delight them would be well received. I think on the front end of the crisis, we saw a lot of organizations really communicating to their key constituents all the steps that they were taking to keep their own people safe, to keep their own operations healthy and safe. And frankly, a lot of that, I think, got kind of old fast, where you just kept getting these, emails or messages about this is what we're doing to protect and be healthy. And then we seemed to move into a second phase where we started getting more of the PSA type communications, particularly from pro sports teams, but also at the collegiate level, where you had coaches coming on and reminding people to wash their hands and to be healthy and to be safe. And I think that was a step in the right direction. And then we went more into the charitable, philanthropic aspects of it, where we saw organizations, individual athletes doing their part to raise money to help people that really needed it during this, terrible time. And then we entered a third phase, which I frankly think was the phase where people really started to understand the type of content that would be well received, that in fact would surprise and delight and engage. And that was content that started really being more like utilitarian, meaning I was really amazed by some stuff that was put out by the PGA Tour, where they had individual golfers, literally from their hallway in their homes, giving tips on how to make a chip shot, right? And, on the one hand, that might sound pretty mundane when you're in the middle of a pandemic, but if you've got 3 or 4 kids at your house that you're trying to homeschool, you're also trying to keep them engaged, content like that really went a long way. And we saw that in sports leagues, and we saw it, at every level, individual athletes. And so that's kind of where we have been, and we're still seeing some of that content. But I think the thing that's on everybody's mind now is what's next, and how do we really kind of come out of this? And, going in this crisis or any other crisis, we've always stated how important it is to really isolate the crisis team and get them thinking just about the crisis and not have them, diverted into a lot of other directions trying to do their day jobs. And I think, Steve, you and I would agree that that would hold true today as we now look at what comes next. And so the organizations, some of the organizations that we've been talking to have isolated a group of people who are literally spending every waking hour thinking about every aspect of coming back. And Steve, I don't know if you want to comment on that from some of the things that you've observed as well.
Yeah, you really do need a dedicated team just to focus on that, because you got enough other issues dealing with the staff and certainly the emotional and financial traumas that a lot of folks are having right now. I think you need to start communicating about that process to the various constituent groups. What's it going to look like? People need reassurance that you've thought about all the different potential problems, whether it's a health issue or a distancing issue or a legal issue, operational issues, you name it. So, just letting people know that this is what we're working on, this is what we're thinking about, this is what we're planning, this is what our timing looks like. Stuff that's sort of, for the folks in the industry, is kind of simple. For folks on the outside, they really want the reassurance that you're thinking about all those issues. And then, what are those issues? What are the steps you're going to take? So is it differences in how you're going to take the thermometer temperature of, with a distance thermometer of folks coming in the building, which I think we're going to see. Who'd have thought before 9/11 we'd all be walking through metal detectors to go to sporting events and entertainment events and to get on an airplane, but we're going to be checking temperatures. We're going to have extra cleaning. We're going to have extra staff to spread out how people come in events. Eventually, eventually at the front end, you may be playing with very few fans or no fans or socially distanced fans. So what does that look like? But you're going to have to get people feeling comfortable with being in a crowd. And if you look at the surveys right now, the number one thing people are afraid of is being in a crowd. So they'd rather get on an airplane. They'd rather do a whole host of other things before that. But you're going to have to really reassure them. And that's going to mean constant transparency and constant communication.
Yeah, a lot of the universities have sort of set June up as the date when they're going to communicate what comes next. And I think you're right. We've said in crisis situations that sometimes process can be your friend. And, just as you're stating here, what we mean by that is letting people feel like they're inside the ropes, observing firsthand all the things that you're doing to inform the decision. So for example, if you're an athletic director or you're the president of the university, letting them know that you're talking to your student athletes. You're asking your student athletes, what their thoughts and their opinions are. You're talking to your major donors. You're obviously talking to as many fans as you can and really kind of getting that input. And as you say, sharing with them the steps that you're taking to make the evaluation and to sort of drive the decision, recognizing that no matter which decision that you make, there are going to be people who are against it. But I think you'll get the credit for being diligent as you work your way through the process.
Yeah, and I think you've got opportunities to make some changes in your business practices. I mean, technology is going to take more precedent, right? You're using, taking somebody's temperature from a distance. You're going to have to invest in that kind of technology. I think you're going to see changes in how we actually conduct business in the venues, right? So moving away from hard tickets. I don't think there's going to be any hard tickets after this, because you don't want people touching the ticket, handing it back and forth, right? So it'll be computer tickets. But that's also an opportunity, right? Because you collect more data about where the tickets go. If you set it up, if you have a database, if you have the technology, I think the same thing's going to happen at concession stands. There's going to be no more cash transactions at concession stands. You're already seeing that in retail outlets that are partly open, right? They'll take your cash, but they're not going to give you any cash back. They don't. So, but again, if you have the technology, if you have a database, if you got somebody helping you with that, like an SSB or somebody else, you can take that data in. Now you know who's in your building. Now you know what their spending is. You may be seeing people have to opt into their cell phone being tracked, right? That whenever you come in contact with somebody that's tested positive, we're not going to let you come in the building unless you've got that software on your phone and be able to track whether you've been sick or you come in contact with somebody who's been sick. So there's going to be a lot of, I think, integrations in technology to get to the point where people feel safe in these venues.
One of the interesting things, we talked about process and we talked about all the detailed planning that's going to be going into this. And I'm sure many of the people that are joining us this morning are well into that. But one of the most interesting conversations I had was with the PGA Tour about midway through this. And I think, by the way, they've really demonstrated great leadership. And Jay Monahan was asked, to sort of give us some flavor of what was going on the moment they were making the decision at about midnight after they played the first round of the Players' Championship to effectively shut it down the next day. And I found it really fascinating. He said, Jeff, what we did was we went back and we read our mission statement. And I know mission statements can sometimes be wallpaper, but he said when we read our mission statement and we looked at our core values, it became crystal clear to everybody on that leadership team the decision that we had to make that night. And I think that's true for a lot of organizations. If you really go back and say on principle, what do we stand for? And so I think as you go into the minutia of the detailed planning, it never hurts to take that step back and say, okay, what are we about here and how does that drive our decision? The other thing I found fascinating about the PGA Tour is they were very clear about developing a mindset among their leadership team that they were going to emerge from this as winners, that they were going to emerge better than they went into it. And I think that speaks to some of the things you're speaking of with regard to everything from ticket handling to fan engagement. We saw the NFL draft. It was really fascinating. I think they got record numbers, which kind of surprised me, honestly. I think it shows just how hungry we are for sports of any kind. But I was talking to some folks in the NFL, and it's probably likely that, when we get to whatever the new normal looks like, let's say next year's draft, that you may see the first two rounds live from Las Vegas, right? But that third, fourth, fifth, sixth round may go virtual just like this did because people really enjoyed being in the living rooms of these student athletes, right? So that's a benefit that nobody could have anticipated. They probably would have never made that change, but they're looking for good things to come out of the back end of this.
Yeah, when you talk to fans, you do all the surveys, they want to be closer. They want to be more involved. So, it's incumbent upon operators in this world to be transparent, to really talk cold turkey, depending upon what the constituent group, if it's student athletes or your players or your staff, they got to understand what's going to happen to them financially, what's going to happen to them with their job, what's going to happen with them with their school. I think if it's donors or season ticket holders, do I get to roll my money over if I don't play the game this year, or are you going to give it back to me? What's happening to my donation? A lot of these people really don't understand because they see sort of the big TV contracts or whatnot out there. The most athletic departments are subsidized, particularly outside of the Power Five, are heavily subsidized by tuition dollars and student fees. And so there's not really a lot of money sloshing around out there. These universities, athletic departments are going to be under tremendous pressure. But the only way people are going to understand that is if you really are transparent and talk turkey with them.
Right. Before we ever heard of COVID-19, you and I had been involved with a number of institutions that were really trying to rationalize, their budgets and the number of sports that they were supporting, across the board. And you've been an athletic director, you've been a general manager, of a number of different professional leagues in virtually every sport. And it almost feels like this could be a gift when you speak about transparency, to start to really have some straightforward conversations, particularly with your donors, about what it takes to sustain a program. Because as you and I both know, when a president and an AD make the decision that, hey, maybe if we really want to be great at football, we really want to be great at basketball, men's basketball, maybe we need to really think through, if we're living in a part of the country that, has 4 months of snow, do we really want a golf team? But then when they go to make the move to say, we're going to cut the golf team, their donors, particularly alums that maybe played golf, come out of the woodwork to say, wait a minute, that's the most important sport. And so suddenly you have this opportunity for a conversation to say, okay, I love your passion for the sport. Let's talk about what it really takes to sustain it. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, Steve, and some of the things that we've seen and heard, and whether there's an opportunity in this climate to have some of those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I think there is. And I think you need to be, as we said, transparent with the student athletes, with the coaches, with the donors, with the alums. The reality is because so many athletic departments are undergirded by student fees and tuition dollars, and the schools are scared about what's going to happen with re-enrollment in the fall, and certainly they've seen their endowments drop, right? They're not going to get the same kind of revenue out of their endowments that they got in the past. That there's going to be shortfalls, and there already are, on the main campus. And so it makes it tougher to support athletics. What I really think needs to happen is those universities need to start thinking about their cost. So do they need to be in a conference that's, thousands of miles worth of travel every time you want to put 16 or 18 or 20 more teams on the road? Or should you be in a conference that's more geographically centered? Certainly you're starting to see schools talk about coordinating their scheduling, right? And playing regional games with other conferences. You started before this, starting to see schools in many of the conferences start to make decisions based on cost, which is usually about your third biggest cost. Moving in amongst the Summit League, the Horizon League, the WAC, some of those kind of conferences to reduce costs and to rationalize those costs against what their revenues are. But I think what a lot of schools are missing is really trying to drive revenues. They don't have infrastructures in place in many of them to have a good database. They don't have great CRM systems often. They aren't getting the right message to the right people at the right time. And so, somebody that grew up as maybe a woman on the swimming team, had 4 great years there, got her degree and has been successful in business for 20 years or so. She's not interested in buying football tickets, but she might very well be interested in endowing a scholarship for the swimming team. So you have to understand who that person is and get the right message to them at the right time to help undergird this, because otherwise these schools are going to be in a position to have to whack costs by cutting sports. And I don't think that's good for the schools. It's certainly something no athletic director wants to do. It damages the brand, I think, of the institution as a whole, and it hurts the whole Olympic process in this country, which really universities have undergirded our Olympic effort for decades.
You make a really good point, because when tragic times like this hit, quote unquote, families become tighter and they become tighter knit. So there probably is an opportunity to have a different kind of conversation, with your donor base, with your fan base. And again, the degree to which you're transparent and you sort of set your mind on a goal that everybody could agree would be what everybody would like to see, all things equal. I think a lot of people would be surprised just how much they'll receive in terms of ideas, frankly, in terms of dollars, to support the programs. So, you mentioned realignment. It's, everybody was sort of looking to the next TV horizon, 2024, thereabouts. But do you think it's possible that we could see some conference, realignment that is not so much driven by television contracts and revenue, but is driven by the practical nature of needing to, cut costs and to make travel less burdensome, for student athletes? Do you think that's something we might see?
Yeah, I think there's really sort of two different worlds. There's the Power 5 schools, and generally, I think the revenues will continue to go up there, and so they'll be able to survive. Although, the reality is there's not a lot of the Power 5 schools that break even or make any money. I mean, you got about a dozen in that category when you really strip all the costs out that are undergirded by the school. But the Group of 5 and the rest of the conferences out there are going to find it harder and harder to get more revenue out of the cable empires and ESPN and the rest. And so what you've seen is those conferences chase TV dollars for years without really taking into account the other, which is largely driven by football and men's basketball. Without taking into account the other 14, 16, 18, 20 sports that you got to put on the road and fly all over the place. When it would have been far easier to just put them on a bus and let them go down and play somebody within 100 miles or 50 miles and get them back that night so they can get back into the classroom, so they could not having to spend all that time away from school, keeps the professors happy, makes for better academic outcomes. And so I think you could you're starting to see it slowly before the virus. I was mentioned in the Horizon League and Summit, and what's happened with some of the college hockey conferences. People are trying to cut costs because you're not going to make as much on the television side as you can make up on the cost side by not flying student athletes all over the country from Wednesday to Sunday. The other thing I think you're going to see is there's a number of sports out there. A lot of schools that play baseball, softball, volleyball, they'll play more than the minimum number of games required. And I think you're going to see fewer of those Tuesday, Wednesday night baseball games that don't drive a lot of revenue for a lot of schools. At a place like a Texas or an LSU where baseball drives revenue and you operate in the black, yeah, you'll see it. But elsewhere, I think it's going to be fewer and fewer of that going on.
Prior to the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of both professional and collegiate, teams were really trying to deal with how do we create more excitement in the stadium because we saw a lot of fans that were just really going to the television experience. And so there were already a lot of institutions, organizations thinking about how do we change the game day experience to create a more engaging environment so that we can differentiate and make it worthwhile for someone to get off their couch and come into the stadium. So I guess that it's fair to say that this could create another opportunity to get creative. You'll have more distance, more space, so to speak, at least in the early return. But do you have any thoughts on that in terms of some of the creative ways that people might try to reimagine the fan experience in stadium?
Yeah. I mean, I do think you're going to see probably more entertainment outside the facilities because you're probably going to want to stagger when people come in the building, right? So you don't want this rush of folks standing all together at the ticket lines, or if they're going through security or getting their temperature taken, for instance. I think, yes, you've started to see a move towards more entertainment in the college space, towards improvements in facilities. But there's a number of studies out there right now from architectural firms that are talking about, nobody's sitting on the first 3 seats on the aisle on either side. And, you're setting some seats in the middle so you can stay 6 feet away and you're skipping every other row. And, when you really look at the architecture of that, you get down to about 17 to 22% of the venue is all that's really available. And so, how do you play a game in the professional ranks to have that make sense financially? I think it's nearly impossible. Do you want to do that in college or not? I think you have to make that decision there. Like for football, men's basketball, women's basketball, volleyball, some places, college. You got the other sports like cross country or that aren't that attended, or maybe a tennis that's not that attended. Swimming and diving, maybe not that highly attended. That you're gonna carry on the event like you did in the past for the most part. But even all of those, I think they do get helped in the long run if you've got a sales effort and a data management effort to try to push revenue there that you haven't had in the past, and the athletic departments, quite frankly, need it.
So this, I mean, I guess, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think that this could be, an 18-month phenomenon, meaning I think that, we get a cure or, vaccination for the virus, and we probably would see a return to more of what we would call the normal setting. I don't think we'll always be 6 feet apart for the rest of our lives. But, certainly this coming season, I think one of the things that a lot of people that are on this webinar with us are sort of on the front lines of making the decisions, and they're supporting decision-making, either if they're ADs by their presidents, or if they're under the ADs, supporting the ADs, if they're in the professional ranks. And everybody, has the same question on their mind, when are we coming back? And it's interesting to see when we went into this, Harvard, I think, was the first university to sort of like make a definitive statement that says we're going online completely. And once they made that decision, university after university, kind of had to follow suit, right? And in the professional leagues, I think actually NBA was the first professional team league, right? Followed closely by the PGA Tour. But I think what's going to be interesting is to observe how it comes back. So, for example, I was reading this morning that Baylor University has clearly stated that they're bringing students back in the fall. They're going to be in the dorm rooms. We've also heard conferences in the Power Five say that we're not going to have sports returning if we don't have students returning. So it's going to be interesting to watch. Missouri, I think, has also made it very clear that they're coming back in the fall. You've had other universities where presidents have gone on the record saying, I don't see any way that we start, with athletics in the fall. And so if you get that going and you start saying, well, let's take a conference where you have, let's say, the Pac-12, for example, and 8 or 10 of the institutions are ready to kind of get back to work, but 2 or 3 or 4 are not. That's going to create a really interesting dynamic. Do you have any thoughts about that? Not only within an individual conference, but then among, the Power Five, for example.
Yeah, well, amongst the sports, you're right. There's coaches, right? The PGA is saying they're going to play golf this summer without fans, and then eventually move to fans. You look at some of the MLS clubs and the way they're talking about it. This is a 2-year problem. It certainly is going to impact the universities on a number of levels in terms of how they make their decisions, right? So there's health issues, there's sort of mission issues, then there's heavy political issues, right? And there's a number of states that are dedicated to coming back, rapidly. You can name them, the Georgias of the world, the Texases of the world. Arizona here is trying to come back as quick as they can. And so what's the legislature saying about the schools opening up? What's the governor saying about it? Those are all going to be pressures. You got, schools like Brown and Missouri and some of the other ones you mentioned that are coming back in the fall. You got Cal State Fullerton just said last week they're going to start online in the fall. So I think the issue is for decision makers, you don't have enough data yet today.
Right.
And, do you start to have a second wave of this or not? You're going to have to run a multiplicity of scenarios to see what happens to your business if you're an athletic department or if you're a professional team. NBA teams are starting to talk about working out. The NHL and NBA both say they want to finish last season and play next season. So I think it's very unsettled. It's got health components, it's got political components, it's got business components, and you're going to see all those. And I don't think we're going to have a good picture of it till we get to probably August. So you better have 3 or 4 options on the table.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's saying we got to know what the denominator is. Yeah, I think it's also, interesting because you talk about political pressures and the like, but I think at a number of these institutions, you're also going to have a group of faculty that may have a different opinion, about whether or not sports really need to be played, at this time or not. But wouldn't you agree that one of the drivers, is going to be survival, meaning that, the revenue hits that these institutions have taken is just, it's devastating, really. And how long can it be, can it be sustained? And so it'll be a matter of, what amount of risk is worth taking in order to preserve, the long-term, viability of these institutions.
Yeah, I think there will be discussions like that. On the one hand, you have big schools. When I was at ASU, Mike Crow used to love to tell me, look, you're only 2% of my budget. I don't want you to be more than 2% of my problems, okay? So, you get the point. They got a $2.5 billion, some of these schools, $3.5 billion budgets. So if you got 50 to 100, 150, $200 million worth of athletic department budget, it's not that big in the big scheme of things. Other schools, and because attendance has been trending down, there are fewer people going to college than there were 20 years ago. More pressure, particularly on smaller liberal arts schools. There's more pressure on universities that don't have a significant online presence, that haven't gotten there like some of the other ones have. And so, in an environment where you're saying to the faculty, look, we want you to take a furlough for the next month, or, 20% pay cut, and most of the money for the university's athletic departments coming out of student fees or tuition, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on those schools. And, talking to some schools that are, at sort of the top of the group of 5 or the bottom of the Power 5, there are those conversations on campus. Whether they gain enough traction or not is to be seen. But there are conversations on campus that, maybe we ought to drop down a level. We're spending, writing checks for $20, $30, $40 million a year to athletics. And, You saw that with some of what happened with UConn, right? Moving out of the American, going back to the Big East, and then focusing on basketball. They'll still play football, but it's not going to be the same kind of focus it was in the past.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we leave the people on this call with as much practical, advice as we can. And so we talked about, going into the crisis, isolating the crisis team. We talked about coming out of the crisis, isolating the go team, if you will, the team that's going to bring us back. But probably worth keeping a crisis team focused on any number of different scenarios that could occur once you've made the decision to come back, right? And really doing some scenario planning to say, okay, what happens if we're back, we're playing sports and we get our first, student athlete that tests positive, or we get a coach that tests positive, or we get like a little epidemic outbreak in one of the dorm rooms on the campus, right? Because those are going to happen. We know that that's for a fact. So probably the need to really dive in and come up with the 6 or 7 or 8 most likely scenarios and really do some intense planning against that for how you would come out of that situation.
Sure. And in the college space, it's not just the sports athletic teams, right? I mean, it's what happens on the main campus, what happens when a professor gets sick, or what happens when the food service folks get sick. What happens, what are you doing in the pro ranks to deal with all the thousands of people that have to work an event, right? Whether it's ticket takers, ushers, security, food service, merchandise folks, right? All of a sudden, a bunch of folks that work for the merchandise company get sick. What do you do then, right? So there's a lot of scenarios that got to be thought through. What's going to happen in the greater community, right? I mean, may have nobody sick on campus, nobody sick on any of the athletic teams, none of the fans, but all of a sudden the community sees a big bump, or a certain manufacturer who's come back online, as you're seeing with some of the Smithfield companies and whatnot, food service companies. All of a sudden you got a hot spot of 600-800 people sick in your town. What do you do with that? What do you do then? So,
Steve, you're a recovering lawyer. I can only imagine what the liability clauses are going to look like, as we come back. So, before when you buy your season tickets, you're going to have to sign your life away to say that if you get this or you get that, or this happens or this happens. I can only imagine, and I'm sure your lawyer mind is thinking through those things. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Well, I do, and I think it'll be a part of what happens with these things, right? I mean, if I'm a franchise, I probably make sure as part of my on-site, website that I've got that the fans plug into, that they're going to have to plug into being tracked for COVID. I think a lot of people out there right now were surprised that when they thought a pandemic would be covered by their business interruption insurance, and it wasn't, right? They're freaking out. And then you got folks out there where it specifically calls out epidemics, and the insurance companies aren't wanting to pay on it, right? So I think the lawyers are going to have a lot of work, a lot of interesting work over the next 18, 24 months.
Yeah, you talk about insurance. I have a good friend who's just immediate past chairman of Wimbledon. And Mr. Brook looks like a genius, because for the past 5 years, they paid the extra amount of money that covered pandemic. So they had, the general insurance, but he and I guess his committee made the decision to go further. And I mean, it was a huge amount of money that they got when Wimbledon got canceled, and he looked like a big hero. Of course, he's very modest, British gentleman, and didn't take all the credit, but believe me, people around him are really applauding. And I guess now, even though Bill Gates and a lot of others have been warning us about these pandemics for quite a long time, we're probably going to have it much more front and center, and we'll probably be thinking more about those types of insurance that are really critical, going forward. One of the things that we talk about in a normal crisis situation is that some of the most difficult planning that we have to do is to get people to kind of see what I call the other side of the arc, meaning when you're in the midst of the crisis, you're putting out fires every day, and it's really hard to kind of take a step back and try to imagine what life could look like. And again, if I'm sitting on this call and I'm in an athletic department or I'm with a professional team, I think in addition to the day-to-day planning for the comeback, it probably would be worth getting a group of people to really try to fast forward and vision, what we call vision cast, the future. And so the best way I can think to do that is if you go through all of your key constituents and you're on the back end of this, right? So you've come through the season, you assume everything's safe. What are your major donors saying about you and the way that you communicated with them, the way that you involved them in the process, as you stated earlier? What are your fans saying? What are your student athletes saying, right? And your ability to really think forward and to anticipate what you would want them to think, see, believe, and do as a result of the actions that you're taking now in the midst of the crisis is really important. It's not easy to do, but the degree to which you can get alignment about that and literally vision cast it, I found it to be the most efficient way to align your senior leadership team around the most direct path, to the future and to success. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's what you see in a lot of psychological studies about holding, right? Sort of referred to, right? The senior person has to have a vision, but he's also got to hold the people in his organization, support them, let them know what's going on, and then we can hold each other. We can hold our customers, our donors, our other constituent groups, and by that you really have to support them. You have to have some empathy around what's going on. You may have a big donor that let's say is in the oil and gas industry, right? And you look up and a barrel's going for zero, right? You may just want to pick up the phone and say, hey, you okay? I'm not calling you up asking you for money. I'm not asking you to finish paying for your season tickets. What can I do for you? Can we have a virtual drink, or something like that, right? Just to check in with, and people remember that, right? And your kid needs some help. Sure, what can I do for them? Your daughter needs some help. Your wife needs some help. What can I do? What can I do to help them with their job or with the university or whatnot? People remember that, and that's what builds a great experience. That's what holds groups together, and that's what ultimately brings success to the organization.
One of the things that people have spoken about is the tremendous impact that this is having on young students, athletes, and otherwise. They really are going through an experience that none of us could even imagine. And I'm just really kind of curious what some of these athletic departments can and should be doing, to help them and to help them think, forward, about what comes next. And you think about seniors, for example, who have to be just full of anxiety. So let's talk about those seniors that, are going to put their athletic days behind them. They have to go get a job now. Well, that's not exactly a fun ride right now. But I'm just really wondering what these athletic departments are doing to lean in and to understand the emotional challenges that these student athletes are facing, right now.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what you're seeing across the entirety of the campus and with young people in general right now, right? If you're 80, 90 years old, like, I went through the Depression. I went through World War II. I got through Vietnam. I got through all this, right? I got it. It's no big deal. We're all going to be fine in the long run. People that haven't been through that don't have that same perspective. But, I think you're seeing more and more on the campuses, them supplying more and more mental health support across the entirety of the campus, not just student athletes. I think you're going to need to use technology to stay in touch with people as best you can. I think we've all been on more Zoom calls in the last 2 months than last 10 years combined. And really be sort of listening to pick up when somebody's distressed, right? I was in a meeting with somebody else the other day, and they said, I'm feeling kind of anxious and depressed. I said, where are you on the scale of anxious and depressed? He says, I don't know, maybe about a 6 or 7. Well, when a guy says 6 or 7, he's really an 8 or a 9, right?
Right.
You gotta be listening for that kind of stuff. And then, where can I support you there? Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Just that little bit of a human touch, even though if it's not a physical touch, that emotional touch makes a big difference.
Another interesting thing, this doesn't just apply to student athletes or students, but I found that, the common perception was that older people like us needed the physical office, to kind of go into, because, it's just kind of how we grew up. You go to the office, right? And that the younger people are so adaptable and these technologies, working remotely. But I've actually found in our organization and a lot of the clients that I'm speaking to that the younger people really miss the office more than the older people. They like that sense of community. They like the sense of kind of getting together. And I've just found that to be kind of an interesting phenomenon that we're going to probably have to, really kind of revisit how we can get that community feeling going again while still, protecting the health and safety of everyone.
I think you've seen it before this when you look at how arenas and ballparks and stadia are getting redesigned, right? There's more and more of these sort of party zones where younger people can hang out and don't have an assigned seat that they got to sit in for 3 hours and have that kind of interaction. So yeah, I think you're going to see more of that, and this just highlighted that need.
Yeah. Well, I hope this has been helpful. It's just a conversation. None of us, has sort of the grail to tell where we're going. But I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't at least share some thoughts on best thinking on where we might be, let's say July, August, September. So I'm going to ask you just to kind of, look into the future and, sort of share what you think might be.
In the long run, I'm very optimistic. We're going to get back to going to games and touching people and going out to dinner and, and all the things we've had. Is that going to happen in the next 6 months or 12 months or 18 months? I don't know. I do think we're going to move towards opening up, and then we're going to have to look at the science and see what happens. How much does this come back? We're sitting at, 55, 60,000 people dead in this country from the disease. We're at 1 million people infected. We'll learn more about the disease and what's the real impact. Can kids go back to school in the fall? I don't know. We're going to find out. But in the long run, it's going to be okay.
I should have introduced our colleague, Christina Rubino, at the front end of this. Christina, are there any questions that have come in through the chat function or
Yes, we do have a couple. The first one's actually pretty specific. It talks about, due to the cancellation of March Madness, for example, the possibility of college football not starting, how will these schools make up for this lost revenue? Is there an expectation that the school general fund will contribute? Will fundraising close the gap? Can schools borrow from private lenders? Kind of thinking through, with the loss of this money, where is this money going to come from?
Yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet. You look at most of the athletic departments, some of them were able to make up for the lost NCAA revenue because the spring teams didn't travel, right? And you may have been able to shove some money from one year to from the future years, ticket revenues back into this year to balance the books. By and large, again, the vast majority of universities are subsidizing their athletic departments. So where's it going to come from? Are you going to borrow it from the university as a whole? I think it's going to be tougher to get money out of donors right now. Their own businesses are impacted. They look at the portfolios that have been impacted. The endowment is going to be down. I mean, there's a lot of bad news out there. Okay. So, but, in bad news, there's often opportunities, right? I think schools really need to pivot more aggressively toward the expectation that not just football and men's basketball are going to make money, but you're going to drive revenue at softball and baseball and track and field and volleyball and all the other sports. And to do that, you're going to have an infrastructure that figures out who your fans are, figures out what's the right message that gets to them, sell them a ticket, get them to endow a scholarship in the long run, create a relationship with them. And a lot of schools don't do that very well. But the technology's out there. I mentioned the company SSB that half the Power 5 schools use to work with their data to help drive the right message to the right people. You've got the ticket selling agencies, the Aspires of the world, Learfield, IMG, those kind of folks, you're going to have to empower them to go out there and get them the right data to make those kind of sales pitches and sell the tickets just like the pros do. So it's going to be you're going to have to hit a lot of singles, to use a sports metaphor. There's not one big home run that's going to fix it all.
Yeah, I think the other thing is really kind of breaking the mountain down into, bite-sized pieces so that you can really,
Right.
because if you just go to your donor base or you just go to your fan base and you just say, we're 300 million in the hole, that looks like a daunting number that nobody wants to deal with. But if you break it down and say, look, we can shore up, softball or women's basketball or men's basketball, whatever the sport is, and this is what it's going to take. And then you engage them and you make them feel like they're helping, contribute and they can come out the other end as winners. Sort of breaking the goal down into bite-sized pieces, I think, would be
Yes.
critical.
At both Arizona State and Texas, that's what we did. We took each individual sport, said, okay, how many scholarships you got? How can we endow those scholarships? A lot of the scholarships are partial scholarships. Okay, can I get somebody, the guy's going to be on the tennis team and he's got a book scholarship, maybe that's $1,000. Okay, so what do I need in an endowment that's going to throw off $1,000? I need about $25,000, right? So if I got $25,000 and I can sit with somebody and say, look, here's what I need. Can you do $5,000 a year for 5 years to endow a book scholarship for tennis? That's a lot easier bite for somebody to handle than give me $1 million, to fix the tennis problem this year. And then, then you sit down and go say, okay, here's what I need in terms of ticket sales, right? And let's put a plan together that says, okay, we're going to get 350 people to show up to tennis at $20 a pop, and build a model that says, okay, that takes care of half the operating expenses. And, over 6, 8, 10 years, I can get all the scholarships endowed. Okay, now I'm getting to be in a position where tennis or volleyball or what have you aren't totally supported by football, right? Because there's still going to be more pressure coming on football with the NIL legislation. And so, at Texas, we said, okay, we could go back and reseat the old Greg Gym, say, okay, we got 400 more seats we can sell here for volleyball. Let's put a plan together to sell them. Now we got a sold out building. What do we got to do to endow all the scholarships? We do this. What do we got to do to endow the coaches' salaries? It's this. What do we got to do to create an excellence fund that helps support the balance of that every year? And you can get a group of people involved to do that. But if you just sit there and wait for manna to rain from the NCAA, you're going to be in real trouble.
Yeah, because one of the things that I think you and I would both agree as we move across the collegiate landscape is the net perception that a lot of donors carry is the school's rich.
Right.
At the University of Texas, it was always all that oil money, right? But even at other institutions, there's a general perception that's probably is more positive than the reality would suggest.
Yes.
Any other questions, Christina?
One good one is, during this downtime, where would you recommend, or where should we be investing the most time in communicating with stakeholders, specifically, whether high-level donors or student athletes versus sponsors? Kind of, what would you recommend doing during this time?
I think it's got to be all the above, and it's got to be tailored messaging, right? And so there's going to be part of it you're going to do in person, part of it you're going to do via email, maybe part of it's snail mail, all the social media to keep people informed about where they are and make them feel emotionally involved. They're still connected to what's going on. They're an insider. You've been transparent with them. And I think it has to be repetitious, right? But you're going to emphasize different things to a student athlete than you are to a season ticket holder, than you are to a sponsor, than you are to a donor, than you are to an elected, appointed official. All those are different constituent groups you have to deal with and be able to tell a story that makes sense and helps them understand the situation you're in.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's all the above. And I go back to what I said before, building great will with people. And I think getting them involved, making them feel like they can have an inside seat on helping solve some of the challenges that come ahead. And by the way, they'll take a lot more pride in it when we get to the other side, and they'll feel ownership. So that would be one of those things where if you want to imagine how you could come out of this better than you went into it, if you could look back and say, we really had an opportunity to engage our fans or our sponsors or our donors in ways that we never had before. And the conversations were so much different. They weren't selling, for example. They were really, heartfelt, engaging conversations, looking for input, not just money. Ideas, okay? Any
I
others?
mean, you can do that with a survey, right? Just talk to your people. Talk to the folks that go to softball with a survey. What do you like about the building? What do you not like about the building? What would you like to see changed? Do you like starting the game at 7 o'clock or at 6 o'clock or at 8:30 or whatever?
Right.
Get them engaged and talking about it. You'll be surprised what you learn.
Yeah. Well, I think we're probably kind of coming to the end. I want to thank you, Steve, for joining. I want to also thank those of you that are joining us remotely for this conversation. It'd be really fascinating to be able to have this repeated, let's say in the July timeframe, just after June, when the decisions start to get made. So we may make an attempt to regroup in the June, July timeframe. And in the meantime, I'm trying to do my best to really look for best practices and share those when I see them on Conversations in Crisis off of my book, Brand Under Fire, a new playbook for crisis management in the digital age. And we would welcome your feedback, thoughts. Any thoughts you have on how we can make this more engaging, for example, would be more than welcome. So thanks everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your week, and keep your head high. And let's all come out of this better than we went into it. So thank you.
Thanks, folks.